In England, serfdom had practically disappeared in the last part of the 8th century. The immense majority of the population consisted then, and to a still larger extent in the 8th century, of free peasant proprietors, whatever was the feudal title under which their right of property was hidden. In the larger seigneurial domains, the old bailiff, himself a serf, was displaced by the free farmer. The wage laborers of agriculture consisted partly of peasants, who utilized their leisure time by working on the large estates, partly of an independent special class of wage laborers, relatively and absolutely few in number. The latter also were practically at the same time peasant farmers, since, besides their wages, they had allotted to them arable land to the extent of or more acres, together with their cottages. Besides, they, with the rest of the peasants, enjoyed the usufruct of the common land, which gave pasture to their cattle, furnished them with timber, firewood, turf, and in all countries of Europe, feudal production is characterized by division of the soil amongst the greatest possible number of subfeudatory. The might of the feudal lord, like that of the sovereign, depended not on the length of his rent roll, but on the number of his subjects, and the latter depended on the number of peasant proprietors. Although, therefore, the English land after the Norman conquest was distributed in gigantic baronies, one of which often included some of the old Anglo-Saxon lordships, it was bestrewn with small peasant properties, only here and there interspersed with great seigneurial domains. Such conditions, together with the prosperity of the towns, so characteristic of the 8th century, allowed of that wealth of the people which Chancellor Fortescue so eloquently paints in his Laudes Legum Angliae, but it excluded the possibility of capitalistic wealth. The process of forcible expropriation of the people received in the 8th century a new and frightful impulse from the Reformation, and from the consequent colossal spoliation of the church property. The Catholic Church was, at the time of the Reformation, feudal proprietor of a great part of the English land. The suppression of the monasteries, and hurled their inmates into the proletariat. The estates of the church were to a large extent given away to rapacious royal favorites, or sold at a nominal price to speculating farmers and citizens, who drove out, en masse, the hereditary subtenants and threw their holdings into one. The legally guaranteed property of the poorer folk in a part of the church's tithes was tacitly confiscated. Pauper ubique jacet, cried Queen Elizabeth after a journey through England. In the D-year of her reign, the nation was obliged to recognize pauperism officially by the introduction of a poor rate. The authors of this law seem to have been ashamed to state the grounds of it, for it has no preamble whatever. By the H of Charles I.C.A. it was declared perpetual, and in fact only in did it take a new and harsher form. These immediate results of the Reformation were not its most lasting one. The property of the church formed the religious bulwark of the traditional conditions of landed property. With its fall, these were no longer tenable. Even in the last decade of the 8th century, the yeomanry, the class of independent peasants, were more numerous than the class of farmers. They had formed the backbone of Cromwell's strength, and even according to the confession of Macaulay, stood in favorable contrast to the drunken squires and to their servants, the country clergy, who had to marry their masters' cast-off mistresses. About the yeomanry had disappeared, and so had, in the last decade of the 8th century, the last trace of the common land of the agricultural laborer. We leave on one side here the purely economic causes of the agricultural revolution. We deal only with the forcible means employed. The glorious revolution brought into power, along with William of Orange, the landlord and capitalist appropriators of surplus value. They inaugurated the new era by practicing on a colossal scale thefts of state lands, thefts that had been hitherto managed more modestly. These estates were given away, sold at a ridiculous figure, or even annexed to private estates by direct seizure. All this happened without the slightest observation of legal etiquette. The crown lands thus fraudulently appropriated, together with the robbery of the church estates, as far as these had not been lost again during the Republican Revolution, formed the basis of the today princely domains of the English oligarch. The bourgeois capitalists favored the operation with the view, among others, to promoting free trade in land, to extending the domain of modern agriculture on the large farm system, and to increasing their supply of the free agricultural proletarians ready to hand. Besides, the new landed aristocracy was the natural ally of the new bankocracy, of the newly hatched oat finance, and of the large manufacturers, then depending on protective duty. The English bourgeoisie acted for its own interest quite as wisely as did the Swedish bourgeoisie who, reversing the process, hand in hand with their economic allies, the peasantry, helped the kings in the forcible resumption of the crown lands from the oligarch. This happened since under Charles X and Charles XI. Communal property, always distinct from the state property just dealt with, was an old Teutonic institution which lived on under cover of feudalism. We have seen how the forcible usurpation of this, generally accompanied by the turning of arable into pasture land, begins at the end of the H and extends into the H century. But at that time, the process was carried on by means of individual acts of violence against which legislation, for 150 years, fought in vain. The advance made by the H century shows itself in this, that the law itself becomes now the instrument of the theft of the people's land, although the large farmers make use of their little independent methods as well. The parliamentary form of the robbery is that of acts for enclosures of commons, in other words, decrees by which the landlords grant themselves the people's land as private property, decrees of expropriation of the people. Sir F. M. Eden refutes his own crafty special pleading, in which he tries to represent communal property as the private property of the great landlords who have taken the place of the feudal lords, when he, himself, demands and moreover calls on the legislature for the indemnification for the expropriated poor. Whilst the place of the independent yeoman was taken by tenants at will, small farmers on yearly leases, a servile rabble dependent on the pleasure of the landlords, the systematic robbery of the communal lands helped especially, next to the theft of the state domains, to swell those large farms, that were called in the H century capital farms or merchant farms, and to set free the agricultural population as proletarians for manufacturing industry. Let us hear for a moment a defender of enclosures and an opponent of Dr. Price. Not is it a consequence that there must be depopulation, because men are not seen wasting their labor in the open field. If, by converting the little farmers into a body of men who must work for others, more labor is produced, it is an advantage which the nation should wish for, the produce being greater when their joint labors are employed on one farm. There will be a surplus for manufactures, and by this means manufactures, one of the minds of the nation, will increase in proportion to the quantity of corn produced. The stoical peace of mind with which the political economist regards the most shameless violation of the sacred rights of property, and the grossest acts of violence to persons, as soon as they are necessary to lay the foundations of the capitalistic mode of production, is shown by Sir F. M. Eden, philanthropist and Tory to boot. A whole series of thefts, outrages, and popular misery that accompanied the forcible expropriation of the people, from the last third of the H to the end of the H century, lead him merely to the comfortable conclusion: the due proportion between arable land and pasture had to be established. During the whole of the H and the greater part of the H century, there was 1 acre of pasture to, and even of arable land. About the middle of the H century, the proportion was changed of acres of pasture to, later on, of acres of pasture to 1 of arable, until at last the just proportion of acres of pasture to 1 of arable land was attained. In the H century, the very memory of the connection between the agricultural laborer and the communal property had, of course, vanished. To say nothing of more recent times, have the agricultural population received a farthing of compensation for the acres of common land which between and were stolen from them, and by parliamentary devices presented to the landlords by the landlords. But the brave Gaels must expiate yet more bitterly their idolatry, romantic and of the mountains, for the great men of the clan. The smell of their fish rose to the noses of the great men. They scented some profit in it, and let the seashore to the great fishmongers of London. For the second time the Gaels were hunted out. The spoliation of the church's property, the fraudulent alienation of the state domains, the robbery of the common lands, the usurpation of feudal and clan property, and its transformation into modern private property under circumstances of reckless terrorism, were just so many idyllic methods of primitive accumulation. They conquered the field for capitalistic agriculture, made the soil part and parcel of capital, and created for the town industries the necessary supply of a free and outlawed proletariat. The proletariat created by the breaking up of the bands of feudal retainers, and by the forcible expropriation of the people from the soil, this free proletariat could not possibly be absorbed by the nascent manufactures as fast as it was thrown upon the world. On the other hand, these men, suddenly dragged from their wonted mode of life, could not as suddenly adapt themselves to the discipline of their new condition. They were turned en masse into beggars, robbers, vagabonds, partly from inclination, in most cases from stress of circumstances. Hence at the end of the H and during the whole of the H century, throughout Western Europe, a bloody legislation against vagabond fathers of the present working class, were chastised for their enforced transformation into vagabonds and paupers. Legislation treated them as voluntary criminals and assumed that it depended on their own goodwill to go on working under the old conditions that no longer existed. In England, this legislation began under Henry VII. Henry VII. Beggars old and unable to work receive a beggar's license. On the other hand, whipping and imprisonment for sturdy vagabonds. They are to be tied to the cart tail and whipped until the blood streams from their bodies, then to swear an oath to go back to their birthplace or to where they have lived the last 3 years and to put themselves to labor. What grim irony! In Henry VII, the former statute is repeated but strengthened with new clauses. For the second arrest for vagabondage, the whipping is to be repeated and half the ear sliced off. But for the third relapse, the offender is to be executed as a hardened criminal and enemy of the common weal. Edward VI, a statute of the first year of his reign, ordains that if anyone refuses to work, he shall be condemned as a slave to the person who has denounced him as an idler. The master shall feed his slave on bread and water, weak broth, and such refuse meat as he thinks fit. He has the right to force him to do any work, no matter how disgusting, with whip and chain. If the slave is absent a fortnight, he is condemned to slavery for life, and is to be branded on forehead or back with the letter S. If he runs away thrice, he is to be executed as a felon. The master can sell him, bequeath him, let him out on hire as a slave, just as any other personal chattel or cattle. If the slaves attempt anything against the masters, they are also to be executed. Justices of the peace, on information, are to hunt the rascals down. If it happens that a vagabond has been idling about for 3 days, he is to be taken to his birthplace, branded with a red-hot iron with the letter V on the breast, and be set to work, in chains, in the streets or at some other labor. If the vagabond gives a false birthplace, he is then to become the slave for life of this place, of its inhabitants or its corporation, and to be branded with an S. All persons have the right to take away the children of the vagabonds and to keep them as apprentices, the young men until the 8th year, the girls until if they run away, they are to become up to this age the slaves of their masters, who can put them in irons, whip them, and if they like. Every master may put an iron ring round the neck, arms, or legs of his slave, by which to know him more easily and to be more certain of him. The last part of this statute provides that certain poor people may be employed by a place or by persons who are willing to give them food and drink and to find them work. This kind of parish slaves was kept up in England until far into the 8th century under the name of roundsmen. Elizabeth, unlicensed beggars above years of age are to be severely flogged and branded on the left ear unless someone will take them into service for 2 years. In case of a repetition of the offense, if they are over, they are to be executed, unless someone will take them into service for 2 years. But for the third offense they are to be executed without mercy as felons. Similar statutes Elizabeth and another of James, anyone wandering about and begging is declared a rogue and a vagabond. Justices of the peace in petty sessions are authorized to have them publicly whipped, and for the first offense to imprison them for months, for the second for years. Whilst in prison they are to be whipped as much and as often as the justices of the peace think fit. Incorrigible and dangerous rogues are to be branded with an R on the left shoulder and set to hard labor, and if they are caught begging again, to be executed without mercy. These statutes, legally binding until the beginning of the 8th century, were only repealed by Anne. Similar laws in France, where by the middle of the 8th century a kingdom of vagabonds was established in Paris. Even at the beginning of Louis XVI reign, every man in good health from 2 years of age, if without means of subsistence and not practicing a trade, is to be sent to the galleys. Of the same nature are the statute of Charles V for the Netherlands, the first edict of the states and towns of Holland, the placet of the United Provinces, and thus were the agricultural people, first forcibly expropriated from the soil, driven from their homes, turned into vagabonds, and then whipped, branded, tortured by laws grotesquely terrible, into the discipline necessary for the wage system. It is not enough that the conditions of labor are concentrated in a mass, in the shape of capital, at the one pole of society, while at the other are grouped masses of men, who have nothing to sell but their labor power. Neither is it enough that they are compelled to sell it voluntarily. The advance of capitalist production develops a working class, which by education, tradition, habit, looks upon the conditions of that mode of production as self-evident laws of nature. The organization of the capitalist process of production, once fully developed, breaks down all resistance. The constant generation of a relative surplus population keeps the law of supply and demand of labor, and therefore keeps wages, in a rut that corresponds with the wants of capital. The dull compulsion of economic relations completes the subjection of the laborer to the capitalist. Direct force, outside economic conditions, is of course still used, but only exceptionally. In the ordinary run of things, the laborer can be left to the natural laws of production, to his dependence on capital, a dependence springing from, and guaranteed in perpetuity by, the conditions of production themselves. It is otherwise during the historic genesis of capitalist production. The bourgeoisie, at its rise, wants and uses the power of the state to regulate wages, to force them within the limits suitable for surplus value making, to lengthen the working day, and to keep the laborer himself in the normal degree of dependence. This is an essential element of the so-called primitive accumulation. The class of wage laborers, which arose in the latter half of the 8th century, formed then, and in the following century, only a very small part of the population, well protected in its position by the independent peasant proprietary in the country and the guild organization in the town. In country and town, master and workman stood close together socially. The subordination of labor to capital was only formal. The mode of production itself had as yet no specific capitalistic character. Variable capital preponderated greatly over constant. The demand for wage labor grew, therefore, rapidly with every accumulation of capital, whilst the supply of wage labor followed but slowly. A large part of the national product, changed later into a fund of capitalist accumulation, then still entered into the consumption fund of the laborer. Legislation on wage labor is started in England by the Statute of Labourers of Edward III. The Ordinance in France, issued in the name of King John, corresponds with it. English and French legislation run parallel and are identical in purport. So far as the labor statutes aim at compulsory extension of the working day, I do not return to them, as this point was treated earlier. The Statute of Labourers was passed at the urgent instance of the House of Commons. A Tory says naively, formerly the poor demanded such high wages as to threaten industry and wealth. Next, their wages are so low as to threaten industry and wealth equally and perhaps more, but in another way. A tariff of wages was fixed by law for town and country, for piecework and day work. The agricultural laborers were to hire themselves out by the year, the town ones in open market. It was forbidden, under pain of imprisonment, to pay higher wages than those fixed by the statute, but the taking of higher wages was more severely punished than the giving them. The statute of increased the penalties, and authorized the masters to extort labor at the legal rate of wages by corporal punishment. All combinations, contracts, oaths, and by which masons and carpenters reciprocally bound themselves, were declared null and void. Coalition of the laborers is treated as a heinous crime from the 8th century to the year of the repeal of the laws against trades union. The spirit of the Statute of Laborers of and of its offshoots comes out clearly in the fact that indeed a maximum of wages is dictated by the state, but on no account a minimum. During the very first storms of the Revolution, the French bourgeoisie dared to take away from the workers the right of association, but just acquire. By decree of June, they declared all coalition of the workers as punishable by a fine of livres, together with deprivation of the rights of an active citizen for 1 year. This law which, by means of state compulsion, confined the struggle between capital and labor within limits comfortable for capital, has outlived revolutions and changes of dynasty. Even the Reign of Terror left it untouched. It was but quite recently struck out of the penal code. Nothing is more characteristic than the pretext for this bourgeois coup d'etat. Says Chaplier, the reporter of the Select Committee on this law, yet the workers must not be allowed to come to any understanding about their own interests, nor to act in common and thereby lessen their because, forsooth, in doing this they injure, and because a coalition against the despotism of the quondam masters of the corporations is guess what? Is a restoration of the corporations abolished by the French Constitution. Now that we have considered the forcible creation of a class of outlawed proletarians, the bloody discipline that turned them into wage laborers, the disgraceful action of the state which employed the police to accelerate the accumulation of capital by increasing the degree of exploitation of labor, the question remains, whence came the capitalists originally? For the expropriation of the agricultural population creates, directly, none but the greatest landed proprietors. As far, however, as concerns the genesis of the farmer, we can, so to say, put our hand on it, because it is a slow process evolving through many centuries. The serfs, as well as the free small proprietors, held land under very different tenures, and were therefore emancipated under very different economic conditions. In England, the first form of the farmer is the bailiff, himself a serf. His position is similar to that of the old Roman villicus, only in a more limited sphere of action. During the second half of the 8th century, he is replaced by a farmer, whom the landlord provided with seed, cattle, and implements. His condition is not very different from that of the peasant, only he exploits more wage labor. Soon he becomes a mid-hire, a half-farmer. He advances one part of the agricultural stock, the landlord the other. The two divide the total product in proportions determined by contract. This form quickly disappears in England, to give the place to the farmer proper, who makes his own capital breed by employing wage laborers, and pays a part of the surplus product, in money or in kind, to the landlord as rent. So long, during the 8th century, as the independent peasant and the farm laborer working for himself as well as for wages, enriched themselves by their own labor, the circumstances of the farmer and his field of production were equally mediocre. The agricultural revolution, which commenced in the last third of the 8th century and continued during almost the whole of the age, enriched him just as speedily as it impoverished the mass of the agricultural people. The usurpation of the common lands allowed him to augment greatly his stock of cattle, almost without cost, whilst they yielded him a richer supply of manure for the tillage of the soil. This was added in the 8th century, a very important element. At that time the contracts for farms ran for a long time, often for years. The progressive fall in the value of the precious metals, and therefore of money, brought the farmers golden fruit. Apart from all the other circumstances discussed above, it lowered wages. A portion of the latter was now added to the profits of the farm. The continuous rise in the price of corn, wool, meat, in a word of all agricultural produce, swelled the money capital of the farm without any action on his part, whilst the rent he paid diminished in reality. Thus they grew rich at the expense both of their laborers and their landlord. No wonder, therefore, that England at the end of the 8th century had a class of capitalist farmers, rich, considering the circumstances of the time. The expropriation and expulsion of the agricultural population, intermittent but renewed again and again, supplied, as we saw, the town industries with a mass of proletarians entirely unconnected with the corporate guilds and unfettered by them, a fortunate circumstance that makes old A. Anderson, in his belief in the direct intervention of Providence. We must still pause a moment on this element of primitive accumulation. The thinning out of the independent, self-supporting peasants not only brought about the crowding together of the industrial proletariat, in the way that Geoffrey St. Hilaire explained the condensation of cosmical matter at one place, by its rarefaction at another. In spite of the smaller number of its cultivators, the soil brought forth as much or more produce, after as before, because the revolution in the conditions of landed property was accompanied by improved methods of culture, greater cooperation, concentration of the means of production, and because not only were the agricultural wage laborers put on the strain more intensely, but the field of production on which they worked for themselves became more and more contracted. With the setting free of a part of the agricultural population, therefore, their former means of nourishment were also set free. They were now transformed into material elements of variable capital. The peasant, expropriated and cast adrift, must buy their value in the form of wages, from his new master, the industrial capitalist. That which holds good of the means of subsistence holds, with the raw materials of industry, dependent upon home agriculture. They were transformed into an element of constant capital. Suppose a part of the Westphalian peasants who, at the time of Frederick II, all spanned flax, forcibly expropriated and hunted from the soil, and the other part that remained turned into day laborers of large farmers. At the same time arise large establishments for flax spinning and weaving, in which the men now work for wages. The flax looks exactly as before. Not a fiber of it is changed, but a new social soul has popped into its body. It forms now a part of the constant capital of the master manufacturer. Formerly divided among a number of small producers, who cultivated it themselves, and with their families spun it in retail fashion, it is now concentrated in the hand of one capitalist, who sets others to spin and weave it for him. The extra labor expended in flax spinning realized itself formerly in extra income to numerous peasant families, or maybe, in Frederick II's time, in taxes pour le roi de Prusse. It realizes itself now in profit for a few capitalists. The spindles and looms, formerly scattered over the face of the country, are now crowded together in a few great labor barracks, together with the laborers and the raw material. And spindles, looms, raw material, are now transformed from means of independent existence for the spinners and weavers, into means for commanding them and sucking out of them unpaid labor. One does not perceive, when looking at the large manufactories and the large farms, that they have originated from the throwing into one of many small centers of production, and have been built up by the expropriation of many small independent producers. Nevertheless, the popular intuition was not at fault. In the time of Murray-Bow, the lion of the Revolution, the great manufactories were still called manufactures rayonis, workshops thrown into one, as we speak of fields thrown into one. Says Murray-Bow, the expropriation and eviction of a part of the agricultural population not only set free for industrial capital, the laborers, their means of subsistence and material for labor, it also created the home market. In fact, the events that transformed the small peasants into wage laborers, and their means of subsistence and of labor into material elements of capital, created, at the same time, a home market for the latter. Formerly, the peasant family produced the means of subsistence and the raw materials, which they themselves, for the most part, consume. These raw materials and means of subsistence have now become commodities. The large farmer sells them. He finds his market in manufacture. Yarn, linen, coarse woolen stuffs, things whose raw materials had been within the reach of every peasant family, had been spun and woven by it for its own use, were now transformed into articles of manufacture, to which the country districts at once served for markets. The many scattered customers, whom stray artisans until now had found in the numerous small producers working on their own account, concentrate themselves now into one great market provided for by industrial capital. Thus, hand in hand with the expropriation of the self-supporting peasants, with their separation from their means of production, goes the destruction of rural domestic industry, the process of separation between manufacture and agriculture. And only the destruction of rural domestic industry can give the internal market of a country that extension and consistence which the capitalist mode of production require. Still, the manufacturing period, properly so called, does not succeed in carrying out this transformation radically and completely. It will be remembered that manufacture, properly so called, conquers but partially the domain of national production, and always rests on the handicrafts of the town and the domestic industry of the rural districts as its ultimate basis. If it destroys these in one form, in particular branches, at certain points, it calls them up again elsewhere, because it needs them for the preparation of raw material up to a certain point. It produces, therefore, a new class of small villagers who, while following the cultivation of the soil as an accessory calling, find their chief occupation in industrial labor, the products of which they sell to the manufacturers directly or through the medium of merchants. This is one, though not the chief, cause of a phenomenon which at first puzzles the student of English history. From the last third of the 8th century, he finds continually complaints, only interrupted at certain intervals, about the encroachment of capitalist farming in the country districts and the progressive destruction of the peasantry. On the other hand, he always finds this peasantry turning up again, although in diminished number and always under worse conditions. The chief reason is, England is at one time chiefly a cultivator of corn, at another chiefly a breeder of cattle, in alternate periods, and with these the extent of peasant cultivation fluctuates. Modern industry alone, and finally, supplies and machinery, the lasting basis of capitalistic agriculture, expropriates radically the enormous majority of the agricultural population, and completes the separation between agriculture and rural domestic industry, whose roots, spinning and weaving, it tears up. Therefore also, for the first time, conquers for industrial capital the entire home market.